The sun had already begun its slow descent behind the western ridge when Silas McGrath stepped out of his weathered barn, wiping sweat from his brow with a sun-bleached handkerchief. It had been another long day on the prairie, one of those dry, unforgiving afternoons where the wind carried more dust than relief. The sky above was a faded copper, streaked with the last rays of light. His boots crunched on brittle grass as he headed toward the house, a silhouette alone in a vast, golden wilderness. Silas had lived on that land for nearly a decade. Since the end of the war, he'd come west, looking for solitude after too much noise, too much blood, too many faces he couldn't forget. The land didn't ask questions, it just gave him hard work and long days. It suited him. People in town called him quiet, even strange. He didn't mind. Out here, there was no one to disappoint, only the wind, the cattle, and the bones of old mistakes buried deep in the soil. That evening, like so many others, he was finishing up the day's chores, checking the fencing, counting the herd, gathering tools. The barn creaked in the wind, and the old weather vane spun lazily. He was just about to return inside when he spotted something strange near the eastern fence line, a shape too small to be livestock, too still to be a living animal. His brow furrowed as he squinted into the fading light. At first, he thought it was a dead coyote, or maybe some cloth blown off a passing wagon. But as he drew closer, a chill worked its way up his spine. The shape was human. A girl. She lay half buried in the dust, her face turned to the ground, a tangled braid trailing from her shoulder like a black ribbon in the wind. Her clothes were torn and dirt-stained, her skin bruised and dry. Her hands were scraped raw, and one leg was twisted awkwardly beneath her. Silas's heart caught in his throat. He knelt beside her, gently brushing the hair from her face. She couldn't have been more than 16. Her skin was tanned deep by sun and wind, and her features unmistakably marked her as Apache. He glanced around, instinctively scanning the horizon. Empty, as always. No sign of horses, no riders, no trail. How had she gotten here, and why? The land was endless and cruel. No one survived out here alone for long, let alone a girl her age. She stirred faintly, a soft groan escaping her cracked lips. Silas leaned in closer. Her eyes fluttered open for a second, but they didn't seem to see him. Her lips moved as though trying to form words. But all that came out was a breath, a whisper, carried away by the wind. He froze, torn between instinct and caution. He knew what it meant to help a native child out here. Even in these parts, the tension still ran deep. Ranchers whispered about raids in the hills. Families clutched their rifles tighter. The past hadn't faded. But as he looked at the girl, lying helpless in the dirt, Silas felt something old stir inside him, something that had once been compassion. Back before the war, had taught him to build walls around his heart. He reached out with a steady hand, and gently lifted her from the ground. She was light, almost too light, like her strength had already begun to leave her body. She didn't resist. Her head slumped against his shoulder, and he felt the faintest beat of her heart against his chest. The dust swirled around them as Silas turned and carried her back toward the ranch house, boots crunching softly in the prairie silence. Each step felt heavier, not from her weight, but from the weight of the unknown, what this choice might cost him. He didn't know who she was, or what trouble might follow, but in that moment, none of it mattered. She was breathing, and that was enough. He crossed the porch, nudged the door open with his shoulder, and stepped into the small, dim cabin. The oil lamp on the table flickered to life, casting a warm glow across the wooden walls and worn floorboards. He laid her gently on the old sofa near the hearth, covering her with a woolen blanket. Her body trembled once, then went still. Silas pulled up a chair beside her, sitting down slowly. He reached for a rag and a bowl of water. As he dipped the cloth and began wiping the dust from her face, he realized how fragile she looked, like a spirit barely clinging to this world. The wind howled faintly outside, as if the prairie itself was watching. And deep down, Silas couldn't shake the feeling that something far greater than himself had just begun. Silas didn't sleep that night. He stayed near the girl, tending to her as best he could with what little knowledge he had of medicine. He wasn't a doctor, just a man who'd seen enough blood and wounds during the war to know which ones needed attention and which ones meant it was already too late. The girl's injuries were somewhere in between. Her face was bruised and sunburnt, and her lips were cracked from dehydration. There was a gash on her left arm that had begun to scab but looked infected, and one of her ankles appeared twisted or broken, swollen and discolored. He did what he could. He boiled water, cleaned her wounds with a clean rag, and crushed some willow bark he kept in a tin for headaches. He remembered the way the Apaches used certain herbs and roots. He'd seen it once when he was younger, before things had gotten violent between the settlers and the tribes. As he worked, he moved with the quiet focus of someone used to being alone, someone who'd learned that in the wild, every movement counts and every mistake has a price. Outside, the prairie remained eerily still. The wind that usually howled through the trees had gone quiet, as though even nature was waiting for something. Every now and then, Silas would rise from his seat by the couch and peer out the window into the moonlit darkness. Nothing moved beyond the fields, not a sound of hooves, not a shadow on the horizon. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that the land itself had changed since he'd brought her in. The girl moaned in her sleep once, her brow furrowed. Silas leaned forward, gently, dabbing her forehead with the damp cloth. She whispered something he didn't understand, soft syllables in a language not his own. Her voice was weak, almost ghostly, but the words she repeated sounded urgent, like a name or a warning. He listened closely, but it slipped away before he could catch its meaning. He sat back in his chair and rubbed his tired eyes. What had he done? He didn't regret helping her, no, that wasn't it. But he knew the consequences of what others might think. In the eyes of some folks, helping an Apache, even a girl, was the same as treason. Tensions between the local ranchers and nearby tribes had worsened over the past year. There had been fires, cattle stolen, and men shot out by the ridge. No one ever said it out loud, but both sides were preparing for something. And yet here, she was, this frail girl, unconscious on his sofa, carried out of the dust like a dying bird. Silas stared at her and saw not an enemy, but a child. Just a girl who had been hurt, alone, and dying in the middle of nowhere. Whatever had happened to her, she hadn't deserved it. That much he knew. A small fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the log walls. The air inside the cabin was warm, filled with the scent of pine smoke and faint lavender from a sachet his late wife had once hung in the window. That scent was old now, faint but comforting. It reminded Silas of better days, of humanity, of tenderness. It reminded him that kindness wasn't something to be rationed, even in the middle of a hard world. He leaned back and closed his eyes. Just for a moment, the chair creaked beneath him. He could still hear her breathing, slow and shallow, but steady. He listened to that rhythm, let it fill the silence. He told himself he'd only rest his eyes for a minute, but time on the prairie had a way of slipping unnoticed through the cracks, like wind under the door. Outside, the stars turned slowly over the open land. Far off in the darkness, in a place beyond the edge of his vision, hooves began to stir. Silent riders gathered in the shadows, watching the lone house with eyes like stone. Dawn was coming, and with it, the prairie would wake to something no one had seen in years. The light outside was just beginning to shift when Silas stirred from his chair. He hadn't meant to fall asleep, but sometime during the long watch, the fire's warmth and the girl's steady breathing had lulled him into a shallow rest. His body ached from the awkward angle he'd slept in, and as he rose, joints stiff and sore, he realized the oil lamp had gone out, leaving only the dull orange glow of the hearth. The girl was still there, bundled under the wool blanket, her face less pale now, her breathing steady. Silas moved quietly, as if afraid to wake a sleeping animal. He poured water into a tin cup and left it by her side, then stepped out onto the porch for air. The cold bit at his skin, far sharper than it had been the night before. A strange silence hung over the prairie, not the peaceful kind he was used to, but something deeper, more alert, the kind of silence that made animals freeze and birds take flight. He scanned the land beyond the ranch. The sky was lightening to a faded indigo, just beginning to pull color into the horizon. And then he heard it. Not a sound, at first, but a vibration, subtle, like the ground itself, had begun to hum. He narrowed his eyes and stepped off the porch, heart pounding a little faster. The wind had died completely. Then he saw it just beyond the distant tree line, a faint shimmer of movement. Silas walked toward the fence line, his hand resting on the butt of the revolver at his hip, though he hadn't touched it all night. The shape grew clearer. Riders, dozens of them. His breath caught in his throat. He stopped in his tracks and blinked once. Then again, it wasn't a mirage. They were real. Horsemen in rows, rising like a tide over the low hills. Painted faces, bows and spears, war paint on horses. The first row alone must have had 50 riders, and they just kept coming, dozens more, emerging from the shadows until the plains were filled with them. They were silent, moving with eerie unity, the thunder of their horses muffled by the earth itself. Silas stepped backward, his boots crunching the frozen grass beneath him. Never in all his years on the prairie had he seen such a sight. 300, maybe more, forming a crescent along the edge of his ranch. Not moving, not shouting, just watching. The lead rider broke from the line, a tall man. Older, with a red-painted face and a headdress of eagle feathers. His bearing was dignified, calm, but unmistakably dangerous. His eyes locked onto Silas with the kind of gaze that could flay a man's soul. Silas did not reach for his gun. He didn't move at all. His throat was dry, and his breath hung in clouds in front of him. The old warrior rode slowly forward, his horse stepping lightly through the grass. Behind him, the other riders remained still, as though the entire prairie had been frozen in time. When the warrior stopped, just a few yards away, Silas gave a small nod, acknowledging, but not inviting. The man said nothing. Instead, he looked toward the house, toward the girl inside. And in that moment, Silas understood. She wasn't just any girl. She belonged to them, maybe the daughter of a chief, maybe someone sacred. And Silas had brought her into his home, nursed her, protected her, and now they had come to see what kind of man would dare do such a thing. Would they see it as an act of honor, or would they see it as a trespass? The old warrior dismounted. He didn't speak. he didn't raise a weapon. Instead, he walked forward with the quiet authority of someone who did not need to make threats. Silas watched him, muscles tense, unsure of what would come next. Then the warrior stepped past him, without a glance, and moved toward the house. Toward the girl, Silas turned, breath held, and followed behind. The door creaked open slowly as the old Apache warrior stepped inside. The warmth of the hearth spilled across his weathered face, casting flickering shadows along the furrows of his brow. His presence seemed to shift the energy in the room. There had been quiet, healing stillness just moments before. Now there was something heavier, almost sacred. Silas followed behind him, silently, cautiously, unsure whether to speak or simply let whatever needed to unfold. The girl still lay on the couch, curled under the blanket Silas had wrapped her in the night before. She hadn't moved much since then, her small chest rising and falling in soft rhythm. The warrior stood over her for a long time without saying a word, his expression unreadable, neither sorrow nor joy, but something older and deeper. He reached out and placed a hand gently on her forehead, his long fingers brushing across her skin as if confirming she was real and still breathing. There was something in that gesture, tenderness wrapped in centuries of pain. Silas had seen hands like that before, in war, in funerals, in those rare moments when grief and love shared the same breath. The warrior muttered something low in Apache, perhaps a prayer, perhaps a name. Silas didn't understand the words, but he understood their weight. The girl belonged to him in some way, whether by blood, tribe, or bond. That much was now clear. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The warrior stood silent, his hand still on her brow. Then, slowly, the girl stirred. She blinked, her lips parted slightly, and her eyes fluttered open. Her gaze went straight to the old man, and for the first time, a soft light of recognition lit her expression. A whisper escaped her lips, something barely audible, but the old warrior nodded solemnly in reply. His shoulders dropped slightly, a tension released that Silas hadn't even noticed until it was gone. Then he turned. His eyes met Silas's, and for a moment, the air between them felt like a bridge strung between two worlds, one of prairie solitude and one of tribal legacy. The old warrior gave a slight nod. It wasn't exactly gratitude, nor apology. It was something older than both: acknowledgement, a man's wordless way of saying, "You did right." Silas exhaled quietly. He hadn't realized he'd been holding his breath. The warrior stepped past him again, this time heading for the door. Outside, the hundreds of riders still waited in perfect silence, their horses unmoving, their eyes fixed on the cabin. As the old man appeared in the doorway, one of the younger riders, perhaps a second in command, rode forward and dismounted. Without a word, he led the other men up toward the porch. The three entered the cabin briefly, their steps quiet as ghosts. One of them knelt beside the girl, wrapped her in a soft, fur-lined cloak that bore intricate tribal markings, and gently lifted her into his arms. She did not resist. Her eyes, heavy with sleep, stayed on Silas for a moment, curious, almost grateful, before she rested her head against the young man's chest. And then, just like that, they were gone. Back out into the lightning dawn. Back into the vast company of warriors. Silas stepped outside and stood on the porch as he watched them. The riders parted like a sea, making way for the group escorting the girl. As they passed, many of the mounted warriors turned their heads to look at Silas. Their faces were expressionless, yet he could feel the intensity of their gaze, measuring him, remembering him. The old warrior was the last to mount. Once in his saddle, he looked back one final time. Then he raised a single hand into the morning air. Silas didn't know what the gesture meant: a blessing, a warning, a goodbye. And then, without a sound, the entire formation began to retreat. No drums, no hoots, no war cries, just silence and hooves. Dust lifted around them like morning fog as they disappeared into the hills beyond the fence. Silas stood there long after they were gone, the cold wind brushing through his shirt, his heart still beating in his chest like a war drum fading into memory. He'd never know why she had come to his land, or how they had found her so quickly, but something inside him had changed, and somehow, he knew so had everything else. The ranch felt different after they were gone. The stillness that returned wasn't the same quiet Silas had known for years. It was deeper, like the land had inhaled and wasn't sure whether to breathe out again. The silence wasn't lonely, but it wasn't comforting either. It was a silence that demanded reflection. He stood on the porch long after the last rider had disappeared over the ridge, his hand resting on the rail, as if anchoring himself to the reality of what had just happened. He had lived through many strange things on the prairie: storms that rolled in like armies, coyotes that howled like demons under a blood moon, and men whose hearts had gone dark from isolation. But nothing, not even the war, had left him so altered. It wasn't just what he had seen, but what he had felt. That many riders, that kind of power, moving as one, and they'd let him live. More than that, they had shown restraint, respect. Even the thought alone unsettled him. He went back into the cabin, his boots scuffing the wooden floor. The blanket she'd used was still folded neatly on the couch, though he didn't remember folding it. The tin cup of water sat untouched. He looked around the small room, noting every detail, her faint scent still in the air. The dent in the cushion where she had lain, the cloth he'd used to clean her wound, still damp in the basin. These things were small, but they held weight. He moved slowly, carefully, as if afraid to disturb the memory of her. He didn't know her name, she hadn't spoken to him once, yet she had changed something fundamental in him. And in the land, Silas sat at the table, staring at the wooden grain for what felt like hours. Questions swirled in his mind. Who was she? What had happened to her before she collapsed on his fence line? Was she a scout, a runaway, or something more important? The way the old warrior had touched her forehead so reverently, she wasn't just another member of their tribe. And the way they had moved as one unit, without aggression or hesitation, told him this had been no random recovery. They had come for her because they knew exactly where she was. Had they been watching all along? The idea made the back of his neck prickle. Silas had always assumed he was alone on his land, that no one came near unless they meant trouble. But now he wondered how often unseen eyes had passed over his home. How long had they known of him? Was he now marked, respected, or simply remembered? Later that afternoon, he saddled his horse and rode the perimeter of his land. Not to patrol it like he usually did, but to feel it again, to reacquaint himself with the hills and trails, the dry creek bed, the cottonwoods near the western fence. Everything was in place, nothing disturbed. And yet, it all felt changed, as though the land itself had taken notice of what had happened. At the far end of the property, he dismounted and walked to the spot where he'd first found her. The dust had long since settled, but he could still see the faint depression where her body had lain. He knelt and brushed his hand across the earth, almost expecting to find something left behind: an earring, a feather, some sign that she had been real. But there was nothing, only silence and wind. He stayed there a while, then finally stood and tipped his hat to the empty prairie. Not out of superstition, but out of something close to reverence. She had brought more than mystery to his doorstep. She had brought a reminder that no man lives truly alone. Not out here, not ever. On the ride back, Silas caught himself glancing over his shoulder more than once. Not out of fear, but curiosity. He couldn't help but wonder if they were still watching from some high bluff or shadowed ridge, waiting to see what kind of man he would become after all of this. And deep down, he knew, if they ever returned, it wouldn't be with silence, it would be with purpose. The days that followed passed slowly, like molasses dripping through a cracked jar. The autumn air grew crisper, and the prairie grasses began to lose their green. Yet, even as nature moved on, Silas couldn't shake the feeling that something unseen lingered in the corners of his world. He still performed his chores, feeding the horses, patching the roof, checking the water lines, but now, every task felt heavier, loaded with unspoken questions and memories that stirred like dust. In the wind, he began to see things differently. Tracks in the dirt he might have once dismissed now made him pause. A broken twig, a feather caught in the fence wire, the faint scent of smoke on the wind all became pieces of a larger puzzle he wasn't sure he was meant to solve. Were they signs? Or simply the prairie's normal rhythm, now magnified by his changed perception? One evening, as the sun slid behind the hills, painting the land gold and violet, he sat on the porch with a pipe in hand and a blanket draped across his shoulders, the same blanket the girl had used. He hadn't meant to keep it, but when he'd tried to stow it away, something had stopped him. It wasn't just wool anymore. It held something of that night inside it, something he couldn't name. That evening, a storm rolled in from the west, low and dark like a warning. Silas watched it build along the horizon, the clouds thick with menace. He remembered how still the night had been before the riders came, and how the silence had felt like the breath before thunder. Now, he wondered, if nature echoed things men couldn't see. Just as the first crack of lightning split the sky, a sound rose up from the tree line. It was distant but unmistakable drumming, faint, rhythmic, not like thunder, not like anything natural. Silas stood, heart skipping. He strained his ears, but the sound faded as quickly as it had come. The wind picked up, howling across the fields, and the rain came down in sudden, sharp sheets. He didn't sleep that night. Something told him the girl had not come alone, or rather, she had not left him alone. The next morning, he rose before dawn, despite the restless night, and walked the perimeter of the ranch again. The earth was wet and soft from the storm, perfect for leaving tracks. As he approached the fence near the eastern edge, something caught his eye. Footprints, not bootprints, bare feet, small ones, 2 sets, children. He crouched and examined them. The prints were fresh. They hadn't been there the day before. They came from the woods and stopped near the fence, right where the girl had fallen. He looked around slowly. Nothing, no sound, no figure in the distance, just open prairie, and a sky that was beginning to brighten with morning blue. The tracks didn't return the way they came. Silas stood and looked out toward the horizon. He had lived here long enough to know the difference between coincidence and omen. This wasn't an accident. Someone had come back. Maybe not the riders, maybe not with anger or warning, but someone was watching. The rest of that day passed in a strange calm. Silas found himself speaking aloud for the first time in days, just to break the silence. "Whatever this is," he said quietly to the empty air, "I'm listening." He didn't know who he was speaking to. Maybe to the girl. Maybe to the wind. Maybe to the spirits of the land who had claimed her and returned her. But it felt right. That night, as the moon climbed over the ridge, bright and full, Silas stood on his porch again. This time, he wasn't afraid. He lit a lantern and left it burning outside an old signal from long ago, meaning this place is safe, a welcome, or perhaps a promise. He didn't know what came next, but he was no longer just a rancher, alone on his land. The prairie had shifted beneath his feet, and somewhere out there, in the hush between stars and earth, something was watching and waiting. A week passed, then two. No more footprints, no more riders, no more strange sounds from the trees. Life on the ranch seemed to settle again into its usual rhythm. Cows needed feeding, fences needed fixing, and the roof still leaked near the back corner of the barn. On the surface, everything appeared normal, but Silas knew better. He felt it in his bones, in the way the wind carried stories he couldn't quite hear, and in the way the ravens stayed a little longer on the fence posts. Watching, he kept lighting the lantern every night, placing it on the porch rail as a signal. Sometimes, he wondered if it was foolish, if he was inviting something he couldn't possibly understand. But something inside him, something older than reason, refused to stop. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was gratitude. Or maybe it was the quiet hope that the girl, wherever she was now, knew he still thought of her. Then, one morning, just before sunrise, something changed again. It started with a sound faint at first, like hooves against wet ground. Not a stampede, not the organized thunder of 300 warriors. Just one horse, maybe two. Silas opened the door slowly, rifle resting in his palm, and scanned the horizon. Nothing. He stepped out onto the porch, the cold air biting at his face, and walked to the edge of the steps. That's when he saw her dot at the bottom of the hill. Near the fence where he'd first found her weeks ago, stood the girl. She looked healthier, now stronger. Her hair had been cleaned and braided in a long black rope over one shoulder. She wore a soft cloak of gray elk hide embroidered with symbols he didn't understand. Behind her, astride a painted horse, sat the same old warrior who had come into his cabin that day. Silas's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't dared hope for it. The girl lifted her hand slowly, palm out, not a wave, exactly, but a gesture of peace. Then she began walking toward him, each step careful, deliberate. Silas remained still, rooted to the spot as if moving might break the moment. When she reached the bottom of the porch steps, she stopped. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, in perfect English but soft, like the wind over grass, she said, "My name is Ayanna." Silas blinked. Her voice was younger than he imagined, but it held a weight beyond her years. "You're safe here," he said quietly, the words catching in his throat. "You always will be." A small smile played on her lips. Then, with great care, she removed something from the pouch at her side, a small, carved figure made of red cedar, polished smooth by years of touch. It was shaped like a hawk in flight, wings outstretched. She handed it to him. Silas took it slowly, unsure of what it meant. "He watches now," she said, gesturing toward the hills. "You are part of the land. You kept your fire burning." Then, without another word, she turned and walked back toward the warrior. He helped her onto the horse, and together they rode off, not in silence this time, but with a gentle rhythm, hooves clapping like a soft drumbeat across the field. Silas watched until they disappeared over the ridge. He looked down at the carved hawk in his hand, then up at the sky, where a real hawk circled high above, its cry echoing across the prairie like a blessing. He understood now. The girl had not returned to say goodbye. She had come to make something clear. She had not been lost. She had been guided to his ranch, to his porch, to his fire, and now she had returned the gift, not in words, not even in gratitude, but in acknowledgement. The prairie had chosen to speak through her, and it had chosen him to listen. The days that followed Ayanna's visit took on a new rhythm. Life on the ranch still demanded its labors, mending fences, chopping firewood, tending to the livestock, but Silas moved through each task with a changed spirit. The land, once just a place he lived upon, now felt like something he was a part of. It wasn't ownership anymore, it was kinship. The hawk figure sat in the center of his mantle. Every morning, Silas would look to it before stepping outside, not as a superstition, but as a reminder that what had happened wasn't just chance. It was part of something bigger than him, older, deeper, sacred. He didn't speak of it to anyone. There was no one to tell, and even if there were, he knew the story wouldn't be believed the way he had lived it. It was one of those truths that didn't need an audience-only memory, that as the seasons changed, so too did the man. Neighbors who had once written him off as a reclusive old rancher now found him quieter, yes, but not distant. There was something in his eyes, something grounded and sharp, as if he saw through things most men ignored. When asked if he'd seen anything strange out on the prairie, Silas would just shake his head and smile faintly. Stranger than wind, talking to itself. He'd say, not much. He began leaving offerings at the edge of his land: tobacco, cedar, cornmeal. He'd set them beneath the cottonwoods, where the wind whispered most clearly. He wasn't following a tradition he fully understood, but it felt right. He was no longer a stranger to the land, and in some quiet, unspoken way, he was asking permission to stay. One morning, in the heart of winter, Silas awoke to find hoofprints circling his barn. They weren't fresh, but they weren't his either. He followed them to the ridge, where they vanished like smoke. No one had knocked, no one had taken anything, but someone had come. Someone had looked, and someone had left. He stood for a long time staring out into the pale morning light, his breath curling into the cold air. He didn't feel fear, he felt watched but not hunted. The way an elder watches a student who has finally begun to understand. Ayanna never returned after that single visit, but he saw her often in his dreams. In those dreams, she stood among ancient trees, speaking a language he didn't know but somehow understood. Sometimes she was alone. Other times, the warrior stood beside her, silent and stern. Once, she placed the hawk figure back in his hands, this time glowing with firelight. He always woke from those dreams feeling steadier, more certain, as if he'd been given instructions that bypassed words altogether. One day, many years later, a young man arrived at the ranch. He wore boots worn thin by travel and had eyes like riverstones, clear and searching. He said he was Ayanna's son, said she had told him stories of a man who had offered warmth when no one else would, of a rancher who lit a fire not just to survive the night but to keep the promise of kindness alive in the face of a cold, unforgiving world. Silas listened, nodding slowly. He didn't cry, he didn't speak much, but when the young man handed him a new figure, this one shaped like a bear, carved from dark walnut, Silas felt the weight of a legacy pass into his hands. That night, he lit the lantern again, not for help, not out of fear, but out of honor. He placed the new carving beside the hawk. The two figures stood like sentinels on the mantle, facing the door, as if to greet whatever came next. And in the stillness of that prairie night, as snow whispered against the windows and the wind carried voices only the earth could understand, Silas finally felt at peace, not because the story had ended, but because it had become a part of something endless. If you'd like, I can now compile all 8 expanded paragraphs.